Hello there, and welcome to another episode of All You Need to Know with your host, Saranya Gopinath. Hope you're doing great today. We have something interesting to talk to you about today, and as always, it's something recent and important in the world of AI. And today we're going to do a deep dive to figure out all you need to know about the new evaluation benchmark called GDPVal released by OpenAI. In our last episode about bias, we did touch upon benchmarks and what their value proposition is in this AI economy. As a quick recap, benchmarks are effectively standardizing mechanisms that are used to evaluate the performance of different LLMs. They are the leaderboards we see every time a new benchmark is released or a new AI model is released to see how they compare against other AI models on certain criteria. Criteria such as the MMLU benchmark, which identifies certain academic parameters. We also came across some really interesting ones like the Hella Swag benchmark, which tests against common sense and how LLMs perform against that. And of course, we also spoke about Indic bias, which is a more nuanced benchmark, which talks about how LLMs perform and their bias, especially in the Indian context. The benchmark world has actually gone a few steps ahead since then. We now have something called the market-based evaluation or the market-based benchmarks, where effectively both the tasks as well as the evaluation criteria come from the real world and pick up from real world instances. They make tasks much more complex as well as the evaluation criteria much more comprehensive. Let's take an example from earlier this year, which was called the SWE Lancer. It was released by OpenAI in February of 2025. It sought to identify software engineering tasks, but with a more comprehensive perspective. They picked up about 1,500 tasks from Upwork and evaluated their performance against two components. One is, of course, software engineering tasks, but also second on managerial tasks. The idea was to evaluate software engineering as the more comprehensive activity as opposed to just the coding, for which several other benchmarks do exist. Which brings us to the other market-based benchmark released in September of this year, in fact, September 25th, again by OpenAI, called GDPVal, right? And that's called GDPVal because it literally tries to evaluate their contributions to the GDP of the nation. It tries to measure model performance on tasks from across sectors to evaluate how they might support people in work they do every day. The hypothesis basically is that in evaluating how everyday tasks that are performed by people across industries are helped or assisted by very strong LLMs, you are able to actually contribute to the economy. And that's quite literally how they started this off. So, for example, GDPVal spans 44 occupations across 9 industries that contribute more than 5% to America's GDP. And they broke that down into about 1,320 specialized tasks. I want us to wrap our head around this, and you'll see a split screen of some of the tasks that they have captured, because it is not just limited to software engineering tasks, which is where, let's say, the common or the so far benchmarked worlds lay. Now we're going into benchmarking against legal briefs, customer support conversations, even nursing care plans. What they did is they broke down these tasks across these 44 occupations and 9 industries, evaluated them against tasks which would have, let's say, about 60% having non-physical or non-manual labor components. They identified them as knowledge-based tasks, and that was basically your set of tasks that they evaluated. The idea was to create a distinction which is more widely based in real world and also covering a wider variety of tasks and evaluations than we are normally used to. There were experts involved in both the contemplation of these tasks as well as the evaluation of the output or the deliverables. They were compared against human expert deliverables to see if the generated tasks were either good, worse, or equivalent to the tasks that were created by the LLMs. And the headline is this: across about 220 tasks, the model outputs were better than or equal to deliverables by industry experts. At the top of the game was Claude's Opus 4.1 and GPT-5, which were excelling across the sectors, particularly across aesthetics, and that's like document formatting by Claude, and specificity, which is on accuracy of domain-specific callouts by the GPT-5. Now, why is this new benchmark interesting, or why should we even care about it? Where do benchmarks impact real-world life users such as you and me? Once a new benchmark is out, does it mean I look at it and then throw out the existing model I'm using and go for the new one? No, not exactly. That is really not the point of benchmarks, though I'm sure the bragging rights that every LLM gets at the end of it doesn't hurt. But why is this new one of GDPVal, not GPTVal, so important? And why should we really look into its impact into the world? There are effectively two takeaways from this story. Number one, big AI is quite literally thinking in terms of GDP. Recently, NVIDIA's $100 billion partnership with OpenAI is literally a GDP-sized conversation. And that's exactly how big AI is thinking of their valuations as well. They're thinking of their output as being a function of the larger GDP of the nation, and that's how they are sizing themselves up. Quite recently, OpenAI's valuation as of August 2025 is $500 billion after an $8.3 billion funding. And Anthropic raised $13 billion in September 2025 with a valuation of $183 billion. These are the sizes of small economies. And I'll be honest, I can't quite wrap my head around it. But what it is interesting to note is that whether or not this is based in reality or whether this is just a company's really optimistic view of themselves, what is important is how the perception of the horizontal of AI is just growing. I know that we all, and viewers such as yourselves, have fully conceptualized the incorporation of AI into everyday tools, but more and more seeing it being adopted as mainstream by the industry acknowledges that AI is not a sector. AI is going to be as widely prevalent as the internet. And that's how our language to it has to change, right? From regulation, governance, even valuation. It's like valuing electricity or the internet. And, in the immediate future, that's going to continue to go up. But at some point, I'm hoping some rationale kicks in. But the second effect of this GDPVal is the race. Just like any other benchmark or any other bragging rights that enter the AI world, what this is going to lead to is the models now rushing to see how they can better perform on GDPVal. And while, compared to other benchmarks, which are also extremely useful, what I find really interesting about this is it is trying to change the makeup of what we are looking at LLMs to be useful for, or even just AI models to be useful for. And this is a good thing, because then what they try to improve their performance on is not only with regards to more and more chaotic images, which is also important, but also a more wider variety of tasks that they try to improve their performance against, whether it is nursing plans, whether it is teaching, whether it is government work, all of the industries that have been spoken about so far and how they continue to grow. The paper that was released by OpenAI describing GDPVal also speaks of its limitations, that this is about one-shot evaluations. It doesn't contemplate iterations or improvements like context setting, which is how normally work is done. And to that extent, they are also fully cognizant that this evaluation doesn't comprehensively say, okay, we are now in a 1:1 as to how humans perform work. But I think the way that they are thinking about it will make these tools much more useful to people who want to incorporate in everyday work, and B, also helps make it more contextual and specific. Where I see this going is eventually the sector-specific productization by these large language models or the big AI companies themselves, where like Gemini has already taken a huge leap at it, where they've taken Gemini and made education tools or medical care tools I would see OpenAI also taking that path after they've taken country-based evaluations, sector-specific evaluations are really what's next. And that will help bring in a lot more nuance, a lot more context to the way that we're using these AI tools, and hopefully in the way that we are able to appreciate and safely adopt these AI tools. Their benchmarks and the criteria that we'll have to set in our individual industries will sort of get normalized as well. But that's at least my take. It'll be great to hear from you on what you think of the impact of these benchmarks and how we are supposed to look at it as average AI users and experts in the field. But until then, it was great catching up with you as always, and hoping to see you at the next episode of All You Need to Know. See you.